When you create your dataset, you need to take into account what happens while the dataset is flattened by the application. Let me explain what this process actually means. So dataset flattening is actually the conversion of your dataset in the report Dataset Designer, which contains multiple data items, into the flat dataset that we have at runtime, which consists out of rows and columns. Now there are basically four different scenarios. The first scenario is what happens, for example, when our data items are going to be equally nested. What kind of dataset is going to be created? Let's have a look in the application. Here I'm in the application, and I have my two data items. What I'm going to do for the purpose of this demonstration is that I'm going to give them the same indentations. So this means that I'm going to have a report with two data items on the same level. At runtime, the system is going to start to process the first data item. And after the first data item has been processed, it's then going to process the second data item. So if I save this data set and if I'm going to run the report again, let's have a look at the data set that's going to be generated. So I'll go into preview mode and I'm going to activate the data set again. And what you see is that we get a column for every column in the report Dataset Designer. And the system is going to start by processing the data item. For that, it will be able to enter information in the number and description fields, and it will leave blank or empty all of the other columns. Then after the data item is completely processed, the system is going to start with the second data item, which is going to be the item ledger entry. And starting from this point, the fields from the item table will be empty, and the fields from the ledger entry table will be containing information. So if you're not going to nest or indent data items, this is the way the dataset is going to be constructed. That's important to know because in the layout, you need to know where your data is in the datasets. There are also other scenarios to have a look at. So let's investigate this. The next scenario that we are going to investigate is that what happens if we are going to create nested data items without a link in between the data items. Let's demonstrate this in the application. So I will go back here into the development environment. I'm going to take my item ledger entry. I'm going to indent it one to the right. So I have indented data items, but there is no link in between the two. I'm going to save my data set. What the system is going to do right now is that it's going to start to process the first data item, which is item. And it's going to see, there is actually an indented data item, so I need to process that. So after the first item is processed, it's going to run the ledger entries. Then the system is going to go into the second item, and then ledger entries, and so on. So it will create a nested loop. This is actually an effect that we are going to notice in the dataset. So let's see the kind of dataset which is now generated. You will notice it will take a little bit more time to generate the dataset because the dataset is now much larger. So let's have a look here in the dataset. What I'm seeing is that I have my first item, bicycle 1000, and actually it has a lot of ledger entries. Then I'll scroll down. Then I see, for example, the next item with a lot of ledger entries and so on. And what we are actually seeing are a lot of items and a lot of ledger entries. But this doesn't make any sense. Something went wrong. The system is not creating the datasets that we expect. Why? Because every item has the same number of ledger entries and exactly the same ledger entries. Why is that happening? Well, because the data items are indented, but there is no link in between the two tables, so the system doesn't know which ledger entries correspond to which item. That's why the system is going to link all of the ledger entries to all of the items and is going to actually multiply this in the dataset that's going to be created. So we're going to be able to fix this by changing our datasets. And that will actually guide us through our third example. The third scenario is we are going to have nested data items but with a linked, or I'm naming this the linked data items. Let's see what happens. So I'm going to go back into the development environment. I have my linked data items, and now I need to connect them. Connecting a data item always starts from the one at the bottom, the indented data item, in this case the ledger entry table. And I'm going to make use of the data item link property. So I will go into the property, and then I'm going to say, okay, which field from the ledger entry table do I need to take and link it, for example, to a field from the item table. So in this example, I will use the item number field from the ledger entry table and link it to the number field from the item table. And that's why it's important to know your data model. You need to know how to link the two tables. As soon as I'm going to set my data item link, I'm just going to save my report, and I'm going to run it again to see the effect on the data sets. So I have my report. I'm just going to wait for the report execution to start. Here we have it. Then I'm going to activate the dataset feature again, and I'm going to go into preview to have a look at our data sets. And now what we are actually seeing is that, okay, our first item, 10,000, the bicycle, has 2 ledger entries. The touring bicycle hasn't got any ledger entries, so for that field the item columns are filled in, but the ledger entry columns are empty. The front wheel has a couple of ledger entries, and so on. So now we can see that all of our data items, all of the data in the dataset is actually correct. And the data items are linked correctly. Now what we need to do is we need to clean up this dataset. We need to get rid of some information that we don't require. That's going to bring us into our third scenario. And this scenario is actually going to be about print only if details. The print only if details is a property we can activate to change the way the dataset is flattened. Let's have a look at the application. So I'm going to go back into the development of my data model. And what I actually would like to do is I would like to get rid of all of the items that don't have any ledger entries. I don't want them to be in the datasets. Now, in order to do that, I could, for example, go into the code of the report and write some CL code to filter out this or that item. But actually, I don't have to make it that complex. The easiest thing to do is to start actually from the properties of the first data item, the data item which has children. In this case, the data item is item, and the child is the item ledger entry. I go into the properties of the parent data item, and I'm going to activate the print only if detail property. If I say print only if detail yes, the details are actually the indented data items, which means that the item is only going to be sent to the datasets if there are details or if there are ledger entries. So I will get rid of all of the items that don't have any ledger entries yet by activating the print only if detail on item level. And now I'm going to run my report again to have a look at what happens now in the application if we activate print only if details. So I'm just going to activate the dataset feature again. I'm going to go into preview and let's have a look at the datasets. If I'm going to open it, what we will see actually is that our item 1001 has disappeared because it was actually an item without any ledger entries. So now our dataset only contains the items which have ledger entries, and the ledger entries and the items are connected correctly. So now I have a nice, clean, flat dataset that contains the information that I require. And once I have this dataset, I'm now ready to start to create my layouts. But first, let's summarize again how our dataset is flattened. So if you are going to make use of one or multiple data items, you need to know how are you going to nest the data items. Are you going to do it equally? Are you going to indent them with or without a link? And are you going to use print only if details? Because this actually has an effect on how the dataset is going to be generated at runtime. We have seen this example with 2 data items. You can imagine it can become pretty complex if you're going to use 3, 4, 5 or even more data items. And that's why it's very important to have a look at the dataset which is generated and verify that it is correct.